It's time for the Blazor Power Hour.
Welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
Introducing the Blazor Power Hour.
No, seriously, it's time for Blazor Power Hour.
Hey friends, it's time for the Blazor Power Hour.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
You're checking out the Blazor Power Hour.
Welcome to the Blazor Power Hour.
It's Blazor Power Hour. Go Ed!
Are you ready? Are you set? Got everything all ready to go? Let's do it. Let's do the Blazor Power Hour.
Hello, welcome back to another Blazor Power Hour. I'm Ed Charbonneau, and with me again is my friend Marin from the Telerik support team, the Telerik support legend here in person. How you doing, Marin?
I'm doing fine. How are you today? Is it early for you right now?
I'm sorry?
What's the time in the States, by the way?
Oh, it is 10 a.m. for me. I'm on the East Coast. West Coast is going to be about 7 o'clock in the morning. So yeah, we're just starting our day here, Marin.
Guys, I wonder if we have any advisors from the LA or somewhere on the West Coast.
We may. We have Mr. Magoo in the audience. Mr. Magoo's a fan of Blazor and a frequent visitor to the channel. We've got a lot of UK folks that join us as well. So we've got pretty much an international audience, I think. And then Chris DeMars, Mr. Detroit himself. Did we start any CSS yet? No, we're going to talk about localization today. Chris, we're gonna do some localization, globalization type stuff. We've got an hour to cover a topic in some sort of capacity. It's a big topic, so it's going to be kind of a big one to fill an hour here. So we'll probably jump around a little bit and go over some basics and then ramp up pretty quickly into showing some implementation details. So, Marin, this is something that I'm sure you have a lot of experience through the support channels with in helping customers in that regard and getting localization set up with our components and whatnot.
Oh, what's weird is that I think we have very few questions about it. I think that people actually figure this out, and to an extent, I think it's because the .NET localization system, especially the one Blazor now has, because WebAssembly didn't have it like a year ago, with the resource files, .resx files, that's something that everyone is used to by now, and people just use it, and it's super easy to use.
I think it's probably underutilized as well. That might be one of the reasons you don't get as many tickets as I might have suspected.
I'm thinking that maybe most apps aren't there yet. I mean, there are a lot of production apps already, but they're kind of young, they're kind of new. So I imagine that most people are still pushing features in, still working on the actual functionality, and they haven't polished off things like localization, right to left support. To an extent, maybe accessibility is also not a super immediate concern for most people yet. Although we do follow the standards in that regard, by the way, so our components are accessible. But I don't think these things are the top priority yet.
I was going to mention accessibility because our friend Sultan Burnham here in the chat, he's an accessibility expert, and it's these type of things that get overlooked a lot, unfortunately. So localization and accessibility are always like these afterthoughts when they should be kind of implemented from the beginning. I tried to hit it early on with the Blazing Coffee demo that I was building, but it wasn't the first thing I implemented because it can slow you down in that prototyping phase a little bit. But once I got the prototypes in, I tried to hit it kind of as fast as I could because I knew I was going to be doing a lot of rework if I didn't hit it pretty soon. The more fields you type, labels for and dialogues you make and any text content you put on the screen, you're going to have to go back and put tokens in for every single one of those pieces of text.
And it's so easy to miss something, especially when you've got 100, 200, 500 lines of code somewhere. It's so easy to miss something.
Yeah, so that's one of the things I actually want to kind of chat with you about today and bounce off of you for ideas. So there is the implementation that I put into the Blazing Coffee app, which we can talk about. And then there are some rough guidelines on the .NET docs. But what I found out was kind of a surprise for me was that there was no kind of best practices put in place anywhere that I could find. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
It's very interesting, and I think that's kind of intentional, at least on Microsoft's part.
Yeah, so the guidance here was very open-ended, which I can get why they tried to stay a little unopinionated here, but it also left me guessing how I should be implementing some of these things that not only included my own localization, but I had to bring in the Blazor Telerik UI for Blazor localization, and then Blazor has this concept of being able to do per component localization, which ended up giving me 3 localizers that I had to try to tie together, and I ended up tossing that idea out and going with a single localizer that would resolve all of the localizers by itself. So we can show that as well today.
Yeah, that's cool.
So first thing I wanted to show is just where you get started in general. So I've got 2 resources here. First one is docs.microsoft.com. So if you're getting ready to build a Blazor app and you're thinking about localization, this is the first place to stop. So there are some notes here about how localization works. There are some different localizers that are supported by the Blazor application. And then there are server-side scenarios as well. So Web API and MVC have their localizers as well. They have an iHTML and a Vue localizer in MVC. Those are not supported by Blazor. But we've got iString localizer and iString localizer of T. And this iString localizer of T is that component-based localizer that I ended up not using for reasons that we can get into in a little bit.
That's because I also tried it and I kind of didn't like it either.
Yeah, so we'll get into what each one of these does and why you may or may not want to use them. Both have kind of trade-offs. The trade-offs for me, and I think with the fact that we're using the Telerik UI for Blazor as well, I think that's what led me to not use that. But we'll discuss that more in detail in just a minute. I'm going to kind of glance over the globalization stuff. This is all about date times and getting your currency formats correct. I think that's a little bit more well known than the whole localization issue. So we'll scroll down a bit into localization. You can set default language preferences through some properties in your application. You can do this.
I gotta stop you right here. First, we have to plug an important note about the one that your mouse is right on. This is the project file for a WebAssembly application. That nested tag, the Blazor WebAssembly load all globalization data flag. If you're changing the culture at runtime, which is, I think, like 95% of the cases, you're going to need that, and people tend to miss it. I mean, it's so often that you start localizing and globalizing your app, you implement some sort of culture chooser, and then it doesn't work. You get errors all over the place, or it simply doesn't work. You get like the US format and you're in the UK and you're wondering, why am I looking at December? I should be looking at March. And that's why. Because this flag needs to go in the project file.
So this is your very first step then at getting your app to use globalization data. So make sure you... Yeah, I think the reason here is, and it says it right here, that they try to put the minimum amount of resources into an application. So if you're not using that, they don't want to turn it on by default and increase your payload size.
It's not an insignificant increase in payload. It kind of makes a dent.
Yeah. So you want to make sure you turn that on first. And then we can start with a default culture chosen in our application. And we'll get into some choosers as well on how to either, you can grab this information from the system. You can also use a chooser like we did in the Blazing Coffee demo. We can talk about some of the UX that goes around that as well. If you're not supporting the localization stuff, you can also turn it off and use the invariant globalization culture, which defaults to English.
To American English.
Yes.
Because Mr. Magoo is here.
Good point.
He's not from here, and he's in the UK. And you know, the major difference with the date format is something that confuses people all the time.
Question from chat: are we working on the editing the content? We're gonna fix up some of our Blazing Coffee app again. We're gonna localize some of the fields for the editors that we did last week. If you're following from last week.
And if you're asking about the content on that page, is like yes.
On this page.
The other direction. This direction, I saw Sakat video and Zoom stuff. So if you're talking about this content, I have actually opened an issue for the Microsoft team, for the docs team, to take a peek at this article because I personally didn't like it much. So hopefully they'll get to it and maybe they'll get to improve it because I think it can take some improvement.
Yeah, absolutely. The docs team's really responding well to feedback on these as well.
Oh, yeah.
So I went ahead and shared the doc for folks in chat if they want to look at this as well. Mainly because I'm going to point out a link here that I think everybody should take a look at. They actually have a sample application that you can use as well. So if you click on this location sample, it will bring you out to GitHub. And there's a very basic implementation here that you can look over that has the various properties and whatnot set on it. And it also stores that information to cookies, which we're about to read about here. So that link alone to GitHub is worth visiting that page and checking it out. They mentioned Blazor Server here, but I believe you also need this stuff on Blazor WebAssembly. I'm not sure.
No, you don't. The Blazor WebAssembly is just like super scoped to the WebAssembly project itself. So it's all it's either in the start code that was a bit of JavaScript, or you do it in the program CS where you just before you call the what is called like run async method. So these are the two places in WebAssembly. Right. And for the server app, I actually find it so much more cumbersome. It's like you got two things in the startup CS file in the different methods, and then you got to do something in the host file, and then you need a controller. So it's like 4 separate pieces of things that need to work together, and you need to kind of synchronize. And that's before talking about any actual localization, any actual globalization, any actual changes to your UI or choosers or anything. Just to get the basics started, you need to touch 4 separate places. And if you skip one, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I know what I was thinking. I was thinking of cookies. I was confusing that with local storage. So in my app, I stored it in local storage. I guess you need the cookies for the HTTP responser. To use cookies to ensure WebSocket connection will probably or correctly propagate the culture. There you go. That's what it's doing. So we need the cookies for, I guess, the SignalR connection to make sure that it's carrying that information correctly. So yeah, it looks like there's quite a bit of setup there for the server side stuff. This component, this is the part that I think got lumped in. Okay, it's under a separate heading. That was,
yeah.
Let's see. So it's no, it is under the Blazor server main heading.
Yeah,
but
it kind of is, but it isn't. Like I think these are the same level headings in both. No, wait, this one is. I think this one is particular to the server because the way the culture user is going to work in server and in client apps is a bit different.
So I don't see a client example then.
No, there isn't one. Client example, like for the server example, goes to navigates you to the controller that will make the new cookie. So you have a new cookie and then you request the Blazor app again. So that's for server Blazor. For WebAssembly Blazor, you just need to change the default thread culture. But if you also need to do localization and all that stuff, maybe you want to actually do a full reload in your browser, so you can actually fetch new resources and you can actually bootstrap the app anew. So you can register the new services with the proper culture if you're kind of doing that. I think we'll get to that in a moment, why the culture may be important while bootstrapping the app.
So I don't know what suggestions you made for them to update their docs, but one place would be to show the example, because it's very similar to this. You still do a navigation manager, you select your language, but the code here is not doing an HTTP request. It is stashing the selection in local storage and then reloading the page. So if we scroll back up to that link that I sent, I think that's where that sample actually is located, is in this this repo here. So if we jump over to this repo and check in pages, it's going to be, no, it's not in the index page. Where did I find this example at? Because I've grabbed it from somewhere. And I have that chooser. Do we have that in our documentation, Marin? How to do that on WebAssembly?
Well, I have extracted that into a separate, like a sample project. I just sent you a link in the private chat so you can post it for everyone. Those sample projects are linked at the very top of this article, so you can take a look. So basically, the chooser itself is kind of the same. You get probably a drop-down list or radio buttons or whatever you want. The key difference is right here. So in this setter, where we know what the culture is, first of all, we set we set it in the local storage. This example uses local storage as well. And then we just do a reload. At the very end of this highlighted piece of code, you'll see the navigation manager, which navigates to the URI and says force load goes through. And that's the full reload that we're talking about. And then if we go to the program.cs file of the WebAssembly app, we're going to see that culture being used there from the local storage.
Looks like SMAB UK found this as well in the Microsoft docs. So this is what I ended up using in. You've got the GitHub link here as well. So it was in that location sample. It was under the shared folder. So it looks like, to me, they should probably put a better reference to this in the docs. It is there if you look hard enough. You can find all of this. That's why I said when I got started with localization, it tripped me up a little bit at first. Once I got rolling, it was a little bit better. But
it's a very difficult thing to document. I mean, there are many moving parts and there are many ways to do it, and it's hard to both provide all the information and kind of not be opinionated because they shouldn't be. And it's a difficult thing. I would personally say that probably the best thing to do is to separate it for WASM and for server Blazors, because it's very, very different.
Yeah, if we look back on their documentation, maybe a tabbed view of this would be a little bit better. How they do the
it's too much code for tabs, I think.
CLI and
I think it's best if that were a folder, like they have for deployment. In deployment, then you have a separate article for WebAssembly and a separate article for server, and I think that would be probably the best thing to do.
Yeah, that's totally fair. We have some articles as well on our website for docs.telerik.com. We're going to have very similar setup in it. The differentiation here is that we have some resource files that we ship out of the box, which you don't get with just Blazor in general. But since we have UI components like charts, graphs, grids, and lots of other amazing stuff, then we have to ship resource files for all of those UI bits, so you don't have to go through and translate all of our UI controls. They just come with those translation files already.
Well, so we have examples for translating to French, German, and I think Bulgarian, and then you can use those as base to do more translations. Actually, I think this is a great time to plug a quick link here, where we have one repository that is dedicated just to translations, and it's all community provided. I mean, if you want to contribute, feel free to do so. We actually grant Telerik points to contributors, and it's also under, if I'm not mistaken, MIT license, so you can copy off of it and take localizations for your app. Right now, I think there are 3 or 4 localizations submitted already by our customers, and you can extend that. So what we ship is basically a set of messages, a set of keys, because our components have there's some strings in their UI, like button text that say OK, or text that's in the grid group header that tells you drag a column here to group by it. So these are all bits that you would usually translate, and we give you the keys for those in some resix files. There is one resix files in our demo that you can use as base to see the keys, and then just copy it for all cultures and translate into it.
Yeah, what's nice is these are all keyed out, so you don't, you can easily build those out if you need to support additional languages, like you said, which we actually did on the other show that I do. Somebody offered up some, I think it was like Dutch or something like that. We added that to the language pack. Speaking of creating all of those translations, there's that repo that we just shared. Again, these are for all of the Telerik libraries. If you want to kind of manage all of these things and create some auto-generated localization values, and I will, kind of tell you to proceed with caution. Like, these auto translations are never contextually aware of what's happening in the app, so sometimes they don't fill in the blanks quite right, but it's a good starting point, right? It's a good thing to kind of like blanket through the entire app and translate it, and then have somebody that knows the language go through and kind of tidy up where things don't look right. But this resource manager, this RESX manager on the Visual Studio Marketplace, is a really great tool for Visual Studio. I'll share that as well. I'm like spamming chat with all kinds of links, but there's really good stuff here. I use this in my demo app just because it gives you a nice interface to go in and edit all of the values. It's really easy to kind of navigate all of your different resources by just like checking and unchecking them, so you get a scoped view of what you're trying to work on. And then there's a button that you can hit that goes off to different translation services and fills in any translations that you're missing. So this thing is really neat. And it's a community built and supported resource, so if you're using it really heavily, make sure you donate or do whatever you can do to help them out, because it is a free community tool that's very, very powerful. We'll take a look at that as well in a minute. Let's look at an implementation here. This is one of the things I wanted to talk with you about, Marin, because we talked about that iLocalizer, iString localizer, and then we have iString localizer of T, so it's a typed localizer. Trying to remember where that is. I think it's under services. Is it under services? No.
Do you actually have
let's
that?
go into program CS here. And I have a, where is my, there it is. Oh, I know what it is. I put it in a base component, because all of my components are going to be localized at some point. So I ended up, I think, putting it in a base component. So if I could find that base component, it's shared. Getting lost in this big project here.
Use the search maybe.
Yeah. So there's a component base in here. Yeah, coffee component base here. It is in the shared. So I created a shared class, base component class. So I could just inherit from coffee component base. So the app name is Blazing Coffee. So this is where the coffee part comes from. So it is a component base derivative here. And I have the Telerik string localizer in there. So I'm using our localizer. And this provides it just an interface to get those localizations by their key. Now, there is, let's see if I can find an example of it. There's iString localizer and then iString localizer of T. The idea behind the typed one, and I don't see, yeah, I'm not seeing a...
I think that the log sample had it, if I'm not wrong.
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
that's
good
something
idea.
that belongs in a sample project. You can't, it's very difficult to document in a human readable article.
I need to link back out to that again. So sorry if I'm bouncing around to so many examples here, but back to the Microsoft example so we can see their implementation of it again real quick. If we look at the index file, this is a typed iString localizer, and this is iString localizer of index, which is the component. And then there is a resource file that is specific to that component. So you'll see index.resource. The problem with this that I found was that you very quickly pollute your project with all these resource files. And the way that .NET scans for those files means you either have to instruct it to find these files if you move them, or you need to put them all in the directory where the component resides. And then you have a folder that, I mean, if you're supporting, say 5 languages, for each language, you're going to have a file with that language. So you're talking every component times 5 files. That adds up really fast, and it gets really hard to manage, and it's hard then to find like your code within all of these resource files. It gets very messy from a developer experience perspective.
I actually have another thing I do not like about it. It's
Go ahead.
the reuse of code. Like, you can't really reuse code with that. You can't reuse the translations you have, because each individual component, each tiny piece of your app is going to have its own localization file. So if you have a text that says from, for example, like choose from a dropdown or starting date or something basic like that, you'll have to repeat it and copy it over for each and every component you have. And that's something I totally dislike, because it's not only hard to maintain for you as a developer, where do I look for that key, how do I call that key. It's also very hard for the people who manage those translations, because in a real application where you have like a massive app and a real multicultural app, you're probably going to have a team that does those translations, and they're not developers, they're linguists. They're the folks that went to study a language while you were studying coding. And they don't code and you don't translate. But since they don't code, how do they figure out all those resix files? How do they figure out how to use Visual Studio? How do they figure out where is everything in your project? The answer is they don't. That's why they need a single place to do it.
I totally agree. I felt that it was just not maintainable in any capacity. Like, it works for a one-page demo app like this, but when you scale it up, it just falls apart. So what I ended up seeing when I looked at this iLocalizer of T was I was going to end up with localized components, and then, like you just said, there's going to be translations that apply to the application as a whole, and not just that one page or that one component. So then we'd have a global localization localizer, so just an iLocalizer. And then if we added in third-party components like the Telerik components, or maybe I brought in some other type of a library from, maybe there's an Azure thing that I'm using, or something else that I'm dumping into my project, that needs to be localized. And now I've got 2, 3, 4 different localizers that I have to resolve every time I open up a page. So you get at least 3. At the very least, you're probably going to have 3 in this scenario. So at the top of every page, could you imagine going into your component? Let's see here. Let's clear the search here.
To have 4. Like, where you have third-party components for point 3, I would add either a point 4 or a sub-point where you have your own in-house components, because every big app I've seen uses third-party components, and it also has a bunch of their own components written up. And so those need to be localized too.
Could you imagine opening up every single component, and having it say at, inject localization 1 through 4? I mean, this whole top of your file on every component would just be filled with localizers, and that's just not sustainable in any capacity. So I was like, okay, that's got to go. And what I ended up writing, I don't know, like I said, I couldn't find best practices on this stuff, but what I ended up with was a localizer that kind of failed through different localizations. And I'm wondering if that got removed from this project, because I have a personal version of the Blazing Coffee app, and then we have this one here. Okay, so the Telerik localizer, is this a class we provide, or is this a custom class? I think we just implement.
This particular class, yes, you implement an interface.
You implement an interface. So when I implemented the interface and created this Telerik localizer, I have a global iString localizer of T, which grabs a localizer that covers the entire project. So that's the common things that are the globally throughout the application. And then I chose not to do the individual components. And then after this localizer resolves, it goes through and finds all of the Telerik localizer resource files, and then localizes everything with that. So I only call on one localizer, but it goes through 2 sets of resources. Does that make sense? Did I explain that well?
Yep. I mean, I figure that people will have already read those 4 lines of code where the mouse is right now, 20 through 26, which is where the magic happens. So basically, it's your localizer first, like that iString localizer of type global, which is the main thing that you're using. And it's just, again, like it's a dictionary. You input a key and a culture, and you output the text, the string. So if that doesn't have this, so right now we're in the Telerik localizer, and we try to use the global one, which makes perfect sense to me. I would also kind of consider doing that in a real application. And then if the main application translations do not have the key, the specific key for the Telerik component, we'll just go to the resource files that we have for the Telerik components. Which
yeah, so I fail over, I go global, then I fail over to the Telerik components, and then you could chain in, you know, if you had a third set of resources, another localizer you wanted to bring in, you could do that here, and you just keep chaining these together. On the downside of this, there might be some performance, you know, the hit that you take to do this each time, but it was more maintainable in the long run to work in this manner than it was to try to set up all these different localizers and name them in every single component. And then once I had them all in one common place like this, then I created that component base that just uses that one localizer, which I just coined L. The L is the localizer you'll find throughout the entire application. It takes care of all the resources. So this made it very simple for me to understand.
I think that if you combine all your translations into one single repository, whether that's a resource file, whether it's, I don't know, some sort of other dictionary, whatever it is, you basically need a dictionary, right? So once you have all your translations in one place, including component-specific ones, including applications-wide ones, including third-party component localization and your own in-house component localization, you just have one single dictionary to go through, and dictionaries are actually pretty fast. So once you resolve that in the main service, I don't think you'll get a really performance hit.
Okay. This is the resource manager tool that I linked to earlier. So this is something that you can find on the Visual Studio Marketplace. I put a link in chat before. It's really a great tool for analyzing the resource files that are in your application. It gives you a nice readable grid format that you can use to look at the data without having to look at XML. The XML for this stuff gets kind of ugly fast. So this is nice. And if you have multiple files, you can just use the checkboxes to open and close those files. And it puts it in a combined view where you can really analyze everything. So this is a nice tool here. One of the things that you can do with this tool is if you add a new translation, you'll see that things in red are missing. And you can come over to the Translate tab, and anything that it finds that was highlighted in red earlier is going to come up in this list, and then you can choose those items and select Start, and it will go through and it will localize all of those, translate all of those values, and then you can hit Apply, and it will actually append those values to your resource file. And again, these are auto-translated. They're not going to be 100% perfect, but they're at least a starting point so you don't have blank values in your application. And then it looks like there's a, I don't think I saw this before when I was using it, but you can prefix these auto-translated items with a to-do. So you can have somebody that knows the language go through and look at all of those and manually verify that they're correct translations, which is nice.
The XML that gets output isn't that horrible. So if you're going to bring in translators that know the languages, it's possible to teach them to use that, and it's possible that those type of to-do comments are something that they can easily scan for and find. So it's actually a pretty good idea. The XML is usable by humans with little training.
I'm gonna take a look here. I want to see just how well this stuff looks. Let's see, can I just do open?
No.
In Visual Studio, it does give you like a regular. Yep. Is there like a view code button in here?
No.
So
you gotta open it in like Notepad++ or something.
Okay, so I dislike XML, and maybe it's a personal thing with me. Maybe I'm biased towards the issue. That's why I keep saying it. I mean, it's not too far from HTML, so it's probably not that bad. But another thing that you can get with this tool that's kind of handy for this, Marin, is you can import export as well. So if you wanted to give these files, like you said, to somebody that is a translation expert, you can actually export it to Excel, and then you can re-import it back in. So everybody these days has Excel. So that gives them, something that you can share via email or whatever. Some of these services, you upload files to their, storefront or whatever and have them translated. If you're using like a third-party translation service. So there is a way to get it into Excel and import it back in. I think there was, maybe it's a drop down here. There's other exporters in here too, I think. So you can get it out in other formats. I just can't remember how to do it exactly. But it's a pretty robust tool. I think it's really neat. Am I using exclusively VS Code? This is actually not VS Code, unless you're talking about comments I made on a past show. I've been having issues with Visual Studio where it locks up from time to time. I think the last update might have finally fixed it. I haven't had that happen in a while. Cool. But I've used VS Code and also Rider on the show a few times while I was having those issues. But good question. Nothing wrong with VS Code. It works very well, and you can have cats and dogs and little pets in your VS Code now. Have you seen that plugin? There's so many crazy plugins for Visual Studio Code. I don't want to get too far off topic. We got about 15 minutes left, but there's like a plugin for VS Code that puts like tiny little animated pets that play in like the bottom corner of your screen, because why not?
Why not?
Exactly. We did it because we can.
That actually makes me consider switching to VS Code. I like that.
Yeah. So one more thing I wanted to point out about using the resource files in the way that we did in the Blazing Coffee app. When I wrote this, keeping all of the resource files, like I was pointing out with the iLocalizer, string localizer of T, having them all under the pages folder and the shared, wherever the component lives in the folder is where you need to have it with that localizer of T pattern, and I found that very messy. And what I wanted to do was put it in my shared folder. So this is a full stack application. I put my resources in the shared folder, and I'm pulling the localization from there. I never did end up needing it on the server, but it's nice to know that if there's something on the server side of the application that I want to use resource files in, I can then pull those common resources from the shared folder as well in my server. So I don't have to have localization resources scattered throughout the entire application, not only on the client in different folders, but on the server in different folders. With this approach, it's on the shared folder, and then the client and server can pick from those files if it needs to. So I guess the main point there is to be very careful with the iLocalizer stuff. It looks, the patterns for finding the resource files I found very confusing. And it does a lot of magic, I think. It does a lot of convention over configuration to find those files. And then I think you only have one setting to tell it where to go find those or to find it on its own. And if it's finding it on its own, I mean, good luck. If it gets them. If it doesn't get them, you don't really get a lot of feedback as to why it failed, right? So you open up your page and it's not localized. You don't get like an error message or anything that says it scanned such and such directory and it couldn't find it. It just doesn't translate. So there are some growing pains with this whole thing. Go ahead.
On the subject of scaling, there is something that I hadn't considered until like a week ago in Jeff's team. I realized that those resource files are super comfortable. They're super easy to use, and in the end, if you have looked at what they compile to, it's basically a static class. So it's just one .cs file in the project compile time that then gets included into your web application assembly. So as your application grows, this can also happen to be a little bit of a problem with the size. It can increase the size of your app. So with the first 1, 2, 3, 4 languages, probably that's not an issue. But as your app grows, you start getting more and more strings. You'll probably start getting more and more resources in there. So in the end, instead of like 2, 3 kilobytes, which who cares about anymore, you may end up bloating your app with several hundred kilobytes of translations or even more, especially if you translate into full Unicode characters where your character is not 1 byte, but it's 2 bytes. So that can immediately double up the size of your translations once you have to start using full Unicode characters. And that size can be felt by your app, like whether you download 5 megabytes or 5.5 megabytes of data can make a difference in a real world application. So that may be something you want to consider, probably not immediately, but just to keep at the back of your mind. As you scale, that you'll probably want to load localization files on demand in some way, instead of including them in the WebAssembly application.
And you can do that through, I think JSON was one of the options that we talked about before the show. You can lazy load DLLs in Blazor as well. I wonder if there's an avenue to get your localization that way if you didn't want to step outside of the .NET stuff.
The problem with that is that it's tied to the router, so it's tied to specific URLs you visit, the lazy loading. So it's not really suitable for localization, I think. What I think is that probably one of the best approaches would be to implement some sort of lazy loading and caching for the class itself. So you can move your translations to some sort of server side or other shared project that doesn't get downloaded immediately. So you download probably on the current culture or a default culture at the first go, and use that as a kind of a hash table at first. And then as the user changes their culture, you can probably fetch those resources only then. Because ultimately, you can probably do a little bit of black magic with, even if you keep using resource files, you can probably do a little bit of hacking into it to serialize that static class. But ultimately, key value pairs, so you can serialize and deserialize that in different ways, and you can ultimately get a dictionary out of it in the WebAssembly app. So I haven't played around with that because no time yet, but I think it's something that I really hope somebody's going to explore.
So I'm going to run our Blazing Coffee app for those who haven't seen it before, and show you where the localization actually takes place. We can inspect, I think the browser covers the basics of localization as far as like providing the language. You can query the browser and ask it what language is selected. I chose to make it a manual setting because not all users use the browser in the language that's set on their system. They may switch these things depending on what context they're working in. So I left it up to the user to decide if they want to select another language here. The whole UX around this you could improve upon. Maybe if it's the first time a user visits, you can prompt them with a selection of languages they want to set as their default or something. For the scope of this demo, I just chose to start with English and let the user select. But we could easily pick another language, and then once the application reloads, everything in the application except for the new bits that we just added this week are translated. So you can see like all of the buttons for showing and hiding columns, adding and editing and deleting items are all translated. So some of the things that we added over the last week here was, for example, a delete dialog. And notice that this is not translated. So we didn't get to the point where we translated the messages in the delete dialog or told the buttons that they need to show a certain translation for the text that's on the buttons, and like the title, for example. So that's something that we need to look at. And
also, maybe the notifications don't have it either.
Yeah, so after we delete the item, the notification that shows here is not translated either. So if we look back, always got to open the wrong tab, at least once per show. You can see some of the values are just kind of hard-coded in here. So what we need to do is tokenize these things and replace them with values from the resource file. Now, here's another part that I think we can discuss, Marin, is the resource files themselves. I look at them from my little resource tool here. And I like the pattern that we have in the Telerik examples, where some of them are kind of like prefixed and underscored to what they pertain to, like the editor, for example. So the editor component has a lot of different functionalities to it. So you see all of the editor things grouped together.
All the tools.
Mm-hmm. And then filter and so on. In the grid, all the components have kind of this name spacing that they provide. I think this helps for two reasons. It's not only just organizational, but I think it provides a little bit of context as well, because as you know, somebody who's bilingual, at least bilingual, I don't know if you know any other languages, but you know that context matters a lot around what the actual translation is. So I don't know if I have a good example of it, but if you're translating some words that are being used in the context of software, they might be different words than if you used in the context of like cooking in a kitchen or something like that. And in English, those two words may be the same, but in another language, something you're using for cooking versus software might be different words. Same thing with like a grid versus whatever other thing that you're doing. The translation might not make sense if the context isn't there. So I think this helps with that respect. Go ahead.
That's why we did that. Every component has its own prefix, and then there are some shared ones, like you see at the top, aggregate. Aggregates can be used in different places, so they're called aggregates. Filter type of strings and filter operators also start with filter because they're the same in the grid and they're the same in the tree list, for example. And that's why we prefix them with the areas that they're used in.
So I tried to follow some of this as I went through my application. I think I may have done a few of the values before I kind of caught onto this pattern, so not everything in here follows it. But you'll see like on my sales page, on my grid, I have certain terms that are used. On the employee grid, I have certain terms. And then some things like cost, documentation, stuff like that doesn't have a prefix because I don't know if the context matters in those. They're kind of just global values. So I tried to follow that as much as possible, but there might be some outliers in here. So that there might be a little mystery meat naming going on in here.
We also have a bug report in the chat. We don't have the Spanish version for export to Excel.
Spanish export to Excel is in English. Thank you. We'll have to look at that one. There's also, you'll see these in red. So punctuation can vary greatly from language to language as well. And this tool tries to alert you to that. Although I've seen false positives in here. So, like in this one, it says report range : and it's alerting me that there's no trailing colon in some of the other translations, and it's not sure if that's required or not. So it does try to give you a heads up, but we went through some of these on one of the live shows, and people were saying that it was fine the way it was, and that was unnecessary. But it's nice to at least point out that that's available, that's trying to help. I added one of the keys here because this was one of the things we were working on. So manage product create in the create method when we have a successful creation of a new product. I put in the English text here. I don't have the translations yet, but I at least have the key set up. And let's see here. I don't think we actually implemented the key yet. So if I create an item, let's go ahead and add one so folks can see what this looks like before we run out of time here. On our Manage Products pages, when I click the Create button, we're going to fire an event. Let's see if I can get the right thing here. We've got a lot of methods going on in this now. Let on successful load. Where's on create? There's update item.
I think it's the on success handler, wasn't it?
Was it the on success?
I think it was the same thing we used everywhere.
This is after a file uploads. I might need to do some refactoring on these. Create item. Create item. There we go. Yeah, and I have a to-do here to localize this text. And currently it says text the product, and then we pass in the SKU, which is the name in this scenario, was added. So now we have a key here. So what we're going to do instead is we'll say text equals, and then our localizer is just simply L. The key goes inside of this here. And that's going to be our localized value, but we want to pass in a parameter here as well. So what we're going to actually need is string.format. So when it pulls this localized template out, it can insert that value in it. So we'll get the key there, and then we'll pass in, IntelliSense is covering up my text I'm trying to type. We'll pass in the SKU there, and then that should fill in that blank for us. And then this line below we'll comment out so we can kind of compare to what it looks like now. We need to go to our We need to go to the resource file and pull the key out. And then I saw you typing something in chat, Marin. Did you give me the translation for this?
I gave you a translation for Bulgarian, so we can just see it in action. Because if we don't have the translations, it's going to fall back to the English one, and it's not clear that it worked.
So there is. Oops! I grabbed the literal text. I wanted the key. I got a little. I grabbed the wrong column. So where did that go? There it is. So manage product create success goes here. And then it will pull the translation out of that field and then insert this into the parameter there. And then Marin has given me the Bulgarian translation, and we'll go back to the resource file, and right here we'll go ahead and paste that in. Thanks, Marin. So we've got two translations here. So that where that 0 is the first argument that we're going to pass in. We only have one argument, and that is our name of our product. So let's see. I think we need to rebuild this.
Yep,
so we'll save this and rebuild it so it can update that resource file. And then now when we come back to the application, we'll make sure we reload this too. If I switch languages, well, actually here, let's delete something really quick. Or sorry, it's create.
It's the create.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and create an item here, hit update. It says the product was added. That's already a good sign. There is no failover to anything in my localizer that I wrote, so it will actually come up as blank. There would be nothing if it fails to find a value for that key. So to just get one more sanity check here, we'll go ahead and open, and the browser is like toying with me here. It won't select. If we select the Bulgarian translation, and then we hit the create again, and we'll just put test 2 here, hit create, and there is our translated text. Nice. So that is just one example of how that localization works. This is on a more coded side of the application. So you'll see we're using string format. We're pulling in the key to get the value from the resource and passing in an argument to the template. In the markup section, you could see these @L pieces of code being used. This is that same localizer in the context of Razor. So we're just passing in that to our Razor view and rendering out the actual text in place of this key right in the view. So you can use it that way as well. That about does it for our hour, Marin.
Did it pass already? Oh.
Goes quick, doesn't it? Smab UK has a question. Does anyone have a good system for localizing database entries? I don't have any experience with that. So that's actually a really good question. Localizing database
what
entries.
I've seen is not what I would call a good system, but it was a system. And the way they had done that is that they hired translators and they had built UI for them, an entire application dedicated to the translator team creating translations. So it was basically a grid that gives you the keys, and it also gives you columns with the languages. So you go and edit things just like you do with Excel and other services. And then in the backend, that grid kind of takes care of storing stuff in the database, just like any other grid you would have in your project. So maybe that's something you can think about.
I wanted to have a little fun before we go, Marin. Let's have one more test on this translation. I'm going to sidebar your translation for a minute. I'm going to take it out.
All right.
And let's see how good the automatic translations are, since we have somebody here that can translate to Bulgarian for us. I'm going to run the translate on this. So since I had that line selected in my main view here, as you can see, I've got manage, create, success. If I hit translate, it's taking that text and it's giving me all of the supported resource files that I have. So I'm going to go ahead and check these off. And then let's go ahead and hit start. And this is going to go out and grab the automated translation. I don't know if you can read that on your screen. How close did we get?
That's perfect.
It's perfect? All right.
Yep.
That's good. That's a good sign.
That
That
with
makes
the dot
me...
though. Like you see, the original one ends with a dot and it added exclamation marks at the end.
Yeah.
But it's
so
a
this is
a start.
If I hit apply on these and go back, it's going to be in red, and there's that punctuation error, or not error, but that warning that it's giving me that it's different from the source text or the default. So when I remove that exclamation point that it came up with, you see that went away. So it tries, like I said, not all cases is that correct. There's been some false negatives in there, or false positives, however you want to term that. But it does at least try to let you know that there's some nuance to it that's different. So we'll go ahead and save those translations for all the other languages and assume they're right. Because I don't know any Dutch, German, or Spanish. I do know some Spanish, but yeah. So you said the German's okay? Yeah. Is this the question here?
Yep. I think it touches upon something that we covered earlier in the show. Why we don't use the language from the browser, and we just chose to have the specific drop-down in our application. The reason is twofold. One of them is that in this case we wanted to have an admin panel with all of your settings in one place, so you can actually choose instead of relying on some automation. And the second reason is that you can't always rely on the browser settings. So your Windows might be on language A and your browser may be on language B, and in fact you may be a user of language C. And that kind of mismatch is not something that your app can account for in any way, and that's why we chose to have UI in the app for that.
Yeah, one thing I found is people don't necessarily use their browser the same way they use the rest of their system. Sometimes they have settings, their phone as well. So when I built this, I decided to keep the localization and the theming to use local storage instead of putting it in like a user profile in a database, because the one person's habits on, say, device A might not be the same habits on device B. So you might have two devices that you're working with. Maybe you're like Marin, you do support, and you want to see what customers see in their native language on your maybe a certain device, and when you're using it for personal use, you might want it to be a different language. So you might have settings that you want to set manually, and I thought it was good to at least. You could always queue off of the browser setting and provide it as a default, but I think it should be something that you could manually set. Yeah.
Marcus also added a nice point. What if the device is a shared device?
Yeah.
You can't rely on that. So the way I would suggest you think about this is start with the browser and see if the browser gives you something. But consider giving your users the option to change it. And then you can fall back through those options as you see fit. For example, default to the browser setting, and if the user sets something explicit, stop looking at the browser setting. And then your app should consider its user base, whether you're going to store that in local storage, whether you're going to store it at all, whether you're going to store it in a database, in a user profile, in a cookie, or whatever. If you want to, you can even store it in a smart card, who knows. Maybe you have a very special app and that makes sense for you. So think about it for each app individually and talk to your UX team and research that with your users and see what they're going to need, because no two apps are really alike. A factory floor app is probably going to be okay with falling back to the user device. Some sort of kind of document processing or line of business applications probably going to be perfectly fine with user settings too. But your app might be different.
Ooh. Can't get my zoom right here. So one of the ways you can find that is if you do navigator.language, it will give you the currently selected language. So this actually poses yet another problem where if you're going to get the language from the browser has to, first of all, JavaScript has to be available and the browser has to be fully loaded for you to get that. So there will be, just because of the way Blazor renders as a single page application, there will be a brief moment where that data is unavailable to you. So you're going to have to
depends on how you do it. If you look that up in programs while you're bootstrapping the app, you can avoid that delay, but then you're not going to have your user settings to compare against. It's always a trade-off.
Yeah. So to fetch this from the browser, though, you have to call JavaScript to get the the language from the browser. So I've seen some instances where if you're using server-side Blazor, there can be some latency in some of these things. So you may find some weirdness around that as well. So just keep that in mind. But you can grab it here. This might be something that varies from browser to browser as well. I can't remember
Nowadays
how well
it's
the
okay.
support is.
Internet Explorer is dead. So it's okay now. The thing is that you may actually get an array. You don't always get one thing, you may get an array.
So
and
you can
may
do
get it in a different format.
languages. And it gives you all the languages that are stored on the machine. And then I found this one interesting. It will give you English US, and then there's just EN. So you have to do kind of a lookup to figure out if only EN is supplied, which do you default to British English or US English? So it's not an exact one-to-one type of a scenario here. You have to do a little bit of intelligence to figure out what the browser's giving you versus what you should provide back in your app. So I ended up just letting the user pick.
Yeah, which is yet another layer of complexity that you might actually not need at all.
Mm-hmm.
I personally, I actually dislike applications that automatically localize for me. Maybe it's a personal preference because my native language is very unpopular, but I simply dislike it. I'd rather have a setting.
So if I was going to build like a good UX here, which might be something I want to add, this is a demo app, but it still might be something I want to add, is if there is no language setting, maybe prompt the user in different languages that are provided in the app, in those native languages with a selection. You come up with a pop-up that has a couple cards on it that says welcome. Choose your default language for this application and put it in those 5 languages so they can actually read that prompt. That was one of the other things I looked at while I was building this is other applications. Like we've had this happen, I don't know how many times, where either the kids grab the remote and change the language on like our television by accident. And then you're in some other language trying to figure out how to reset that functionality. That could be very frustrating. So having a multilingual page where you can go and set this in terms that you can read in multiple languages at once is a nice have. Let's just say that. And a lot of apps fall guilty to that. I've noticed. So if you set the language to another language, even in this one, I believe it will do it. So if I go back, if I don't know that this means language, then I don't,
Just like Marcus said,
another
adding icons and images helps. So for example, this drop-down can have country flags in it.
Yeah, because so Bulgarian here is not translated into Bulgarian. So these actual languages are different in different languages as well. So this can make it extra confusing. So while we've got some of the basics of translating this app down, there's so many nuances to this. We could go on for probably 2 or 3 more shows.
Or more. There's a lot of stuff to cover. Because then you're going to have to consider the data.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes data needs to be translated, or at least pieces of data. For example, some Boolean flag in the data. Let's say if it's a product, is it available? Is it not available? For software, it's cool. True, false, 0, 1. That's easy. But the end user would rather see something else. Oh, you actually have that already. I didn't know.
Yeah. So for things like the product name, we don't have translation or the group, but we do have localization for the monetary value and
availability. But for example, the group at the very left column, so you have like 5, 6, 7, 8 groups or so. It kind of makes sense to localize that too for end users. if you need that app to be truly multilingual. It depends. Again, like half of the things about localization and globalization, the answer is it depends, and that's why the Microsoft docs are also so very unopinionated about it. But it's something that you may want to consider.
Yeah, and some of the icons and things do help to have on your buttons as well. So even if you don't know what this says, you can tell that hopefully a trash can translates into what you're commonly using for delete. So the icons definitely can add a lot to your app as well. We're going way over time. I'd like to try to keep these to an hour as close as I can. So
I want to just
call
add
this
one
a
other
show.
aspect. Can I just add one other
Absolutely.
aspect that I just came up
Sure.
with while we're kind of pointing out quirks? Translations are extremely different between languages. Right now, you can see that those edit and delete buttons are very short in English, but in the previous screen with Bulgarian, they were like 3 times longer. And that can mess up your UI. So it's something that you may want to take into account when building up your UIs. To provide, especially buttons, but to provide some text, some space for such buttons, and other places to provide like minimum or maximum widths and heights for elements. Just think about, if you're going to localize the app, think about the text that you're going to localize and what will happen if they're super short or super long. Because that happens. For example, Chinese localization or other kind of pictographic language is likely to be very short compared to other languages that are kind of like alphabet based. And a short text message can also mess up your UI, not just a long one. So
yeah, that's an excellent point.
Quirk.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of Bulgarian words are much longer than the English translation.
Yeah, then just like Smabuke said, adding right to left languages makes that even harder.
Yeah, which we do support, by the way. We do support the right to left.
Well, there is work to be done there, but most things work already.
What's nice is a lot of the like layout frameworks and stuff support that as well. So like Bootstrap, if you're wrapping the components in Bootstrap, they have a right to left support if you're using it. And then CSS has changed a lot in this respect too. So things like CSS Grid and what's it called, Flexbox, they're changing some of their terminology to like first and last instead of like left and right, because they're trying to support the idea of localizing those left and right languages more.
Yeah, like beginning and end.
Yeah, that's what it is. Cool. Beginning and end. Yeah, beginning and end have a different meaning than left and right. So in a left to right language versus right to left, begin and end, those things you can manage to swap those a lot easier and support those different types of localization issues. I think we covered a lot of good stuff here, Marin. We're gonna call it a day.
Sure.
We'll continue with the project here to update this page. We've got a lot more localizations to add. I think we were almost ready to commit this one, and then we have some other stuff on the Blazing Coffee app we can work on soon. So I'll come back on Friday and work on that as well. And Marin, you're invited to join me anytime. So you may see Marin here Friday as well. And tomorrow I'll be here with Alyssa doing VR and having some fun with Facebook Horizon. And later today we've got TJ Vantel with our React show on this channel as well. So make sure you stick around for that. Thanks for joining me again, Marin, and thanks to the chat room.
Thank you everyone for contributing and for joining us today. Have a good one.